He bought her for a handful of coins, but the real price would be paid in blood fire and bullets. This isn't the story of how a man saved a woman. It's the story of how a single foolish act of defiance started a war that would forge a family, or bury them all. The silence that fell after the gavel's crack was heavier than stone, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the plaza. He had bought himself a storm. Cal stood motionless in the shade of the livery, the ghost of his brother David, a constant cold weight on his shoulders. The world tilted on its axis, the familiar sounds of the town, the blacksmith's hammer, the distant laughter from the saloon fading into a dull roar in his ears. He had not come for this. He'd come for salt and seed, his list of necessities a familiar litany against the grief that was his only loyal companion. He hadn't come to watch human beings sold like livestock. But then he saw her. Rhett. She was shackled at the wrists, her face smudged with the dirt of a long and brutal journey. Yet she stood on the auction block, not like a victim, but as if it were a throne of defiance. Her eyes, empty of fear, swept over the leering, sunburnt faces of the crowd, with a cold fire that scorched the air. They were the eyes of a wolf cornered, not a lamb, for the slaughter. The auctioneer, a man whose face was a bloated map of greed, called her wild, a good worker if you can break her. Men laughed the sound coarse and ugly, and in that laughter Cal felt the old familiar anger coil in his gut, the same helpless rage that had swallowed his brother whole. He didn't need a woman. His ranch, nestled deep in the canyons, was a fortress of silence, a place where memories were buried under layers of dust and hard labor. But as the bidding climbed, fueled by cheap liquor and the cruel sport of men with too much power, he saw in her chained defiance a mirror of his own caged heart. They were both prisoners, she of iron shackles, he of a loss so profound it had stolen his voice. In a voice low and steady, a voice he hadn't used for anything but necessity. In 2 years, he spoke a single number. $50. The crowd turned as one, a ripple of shock passing through them. The auctioneer, his spiel interrupted, blinked in surprise, his eyes searching the shadows for the source of the bid. He looked toward the tall, quiet man who never bought anything more than what he could carry on his horse, a man who moved through town like a ghost himself. Cal met his gaze, his own eyes hard as river stone, and repeated the number louder this time, cutting through the murmurs. 50. It was more money than sense. It was the price of 2 good horses, a season's worth of seed. It was an act of quiet rebellion against a world that traded in souls, a world that measured a man's worth by his land, and a woman's by the calluses on her hands or the curve of her hip. Here in the sun-bleached plaza of a town that had forgotten its own name, worth was decided by the crack of a gavel and the weight of a coin. He had just thrown all the coin he had on a single impossible bet. The auctioneer hesitated, looking back at the other bidders, but they were silent, sobered by the sheer quiet force of Cal's bid. The gavel rose, hung in the air for a breathless moment, and then fell with a final decisive crack. He had done it. He had thrown a stone into a still stagnant pond, and now he would have to face the ripples. The ride back to the ranch was a long stretch of silence, measured by the rhythmic clop of horse hooves on the dry, packed earth and the weary creak of the wagon wheels. Peace in this territory has always been as fragile as morning frost, and the silence between them was not peaceful. It was a ceasefire heavy with the weight of unspoken questions and the metallic scent of broken iron. Rhett sat on the wagon seat beside him, a ramrod straightness to her spine that was both armor and cage. She had not spoken a word since he'd used a file from his saddlebag to break the rusted shackles from her wrists. The harsh rasp of metal on metal had been their only conversation, a grinding, brutal sound that said more than words ever could. Her newly freed hands rested in her lap, still and pale against the rough fabric of her dirt-stained dress. He had offered her the reins. She had refused with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. He had offered her his canteen. She took it, drank sparingly with a slow, deliberate control, and handed it back, her fingers never brushing his. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the unforgiving mountains that clawed at the raw blue sky. She was not just looking. She was assessing the land, judging its will to survive, and in doing so, she was judging him. Cal could feel her watchfulness like a brand on his skin, a silent weighing of his character against the unforgiving landscape he called home. He was just another piece of this harsh territory to her, another variable in an equation of survival. His ranch, when it finally came into view, looked exactly as he felt, isolated, weathered and standing against the world. The house was a simple structure of pine and stone, built by his own hands, and the hands of the brother he had lost. Now the porch sagged slightly, a tired slump of surrender, and the windows were like vacant eyes staring out at nothing. It was a house that remembered laughter, but had forgotten the sound of it, a hollow place where grief had settled in the corners like dust. For Rhett, he knew it was just another cage, larger and with a better view than the last, but a cage nonetheless. Cal pulled the wagon to a halt before the sagging porch. The silence pressed in thick and absolute, broken only by the tired sigh of the wind. "This is it," he said the words feeling clumsy and loud in his mouth. He expected fear, or maybe tears. He expected some sign of the brokenness the auctioneer had promised. He got neither. Rhett simply slid down from the wagon, her bare feet landing softly in the dust. She stood there for a long moment, a solitary, defiant figure, against the vast emptiness. She looked at the house, then at the barn, its timbers graying in the sun, then at the vast, empty land stretching out around them. Her face was a mask of stone, revealing nothing, offering nothing. In that moment, Cal understood. He had not saved her. He had only purchased her trouble, a living, breathing storm of a woman who would not be broken and could not be owned. Dawn broke over the plains like a fresh wound, spilling red and raw across the eastern sky. Cal rose from habit, the chill of the house, a familiar ache in his bones. The silence was different this morning, taut with a new, uncertain presence. He expected to find the woman Rhett gone, vanished into the vast, indifferent wilderness that swallowed up the lost and the desperate. It was what he would have done. Instead, he found her by the chicken coop, her back to him, methodically mending the wire mesh of a door that had been broken for a year. A fox had torn through it last winter, and Cal, in the depths of his solitude, had never found the will to fix it properly. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life where wasted effort was a sin, punishable by starvation or a beating. She had found a length of discarded baling wire near the barn and was weaving it into the gaps with nimble, steady fingers, her hands surprisingly deft. She didn't look up as he approached, her focus absolute. She wasn't just fixing a coop. She was fortifying a border, claiming a small piece of this broken world as her own. He left her to her work, the silence between them a territory neither was willing to cross. Later, as he was checking the pump at the well, its rhythmic groan the ranch's only steady heartbeat, he saw her in the small, fallow garden patch beside the house. The earth there was hard and cracked, choked with thistle and bindweed, a testament to his own neglect. She was on her knees pulling the weeds with a fierce, steady rhythm, her hands bare, her knuckles already scraped raw. She did not ask for tools. She did not ask for permission. Her work was her language, each pulled weed a word, each mended wire a sentence. I am not a burden, the steady motion of her hands seemed to say. I am not broken, I am a force. In this world worth was not given, it was proven, and Rhett was proving hers in the stubborn, unyielding soil. That evening, as dusk settled like a fine blue powder over the land, Cal brought in a bowl of hot venison stew, thick with potatoes and wild onions. He set it on the small kitchen table, along with a thick slice of the dense bread he baked once a week. He poured a cup of water from the bucket. Then, without a word, he retreated to the porch, leaning against a post, and watching the first stars prick the darkness. He was giving her the space she demanded without a sound, an offering of solitude that was the only currency he truly possessed. Through the unadorned window, he watched her approach the table. She stood over the stew for a long moment, the steam rising to meet her face. Then she sat her back straight and began to eat. She ate not like a starving stray, gulping down the food in frantic haste, but with a slow, deliberate dignity, as if each bite were an act of reclaiming a piece of herself that had been stolen. It was the beginning of a truce, a treaty signed not in ink, but in shared labor and a silent offering of food. He had bought a storm, but for the first time in 2 years, a quiet, fragile warmth flickered within the walls of his house. The night was a deep, starless black, the kind of absolute darkness that presses in on the walls of a lonely house. The only sound was the wind whispering through the eaves, like a restless spirit telling stories the living were not meant to hear. Then a sharp cry shattered the silence. It was raw and short, a shard of sound choked off before it could fully form the sound of a soul tearing. Cal was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in hand before he was fully awake, his heart pounding a familiar frantic rhythm against his ribs. Ghosts were easier to fight than men, but he was prepared for either. He moved through the darkness of the main room, his bare feet silent on the rough-hewn floorboards. He found Rhett by the hearth. She was curled into a tight ball on the cold stone, her body trembling violently, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The fire from the evening was long dead, the ashes gray and cold as memory. She was lost in the throes of a nightmare, trapped in a cold hell only she could see. He didn't speak. He knew with the certainty of a man who had his own ghosts that words were useless against this kind of terror. Words could not reach into that dark place. So he knelt not beside her but a respectful distance away, and began to do the only thing he could. He began to build a new fire. The scrape of flint on steel was a small, sharp defiance against the suffocating silence. He arranged the kindling with practiced, patient hands, stacking the small sticks of pine just so. He coaxed the first hesitant spark into a tiny, fragile flame, nurturing it with his breath, watching it lick at the wood. These were things he understood, the logic of wood and flame, the simple truth of providing warmth against the cold. As the fire caught growing stronger, casting a warm, flickering light across the room, her trembling began to subside. The shudders that racked her body grew less violent, then stopped altogether. The physical warmth was pulling her back from the cold edge of her dream. Her eyes opened. They were dark pools of remembered horror, wide and unfocused. They watched him wary and wounded as he added a larger log to the growing blaze. "The fire!" she whispered, her voice rough with sleep and fear, barely audible above the crackle of the flames. Cal didn't ask what she meant. He didn't ask for the story behind her terror. He simply recognized the shape of her ghost, for it was a cousin to his own. He looked into the heart of the flames he had built, and his own ghosts stirred in the shadows. "My brother David," he said, the name tasting like rust and disuse in his mouth. He made a promise to a family once. The fire took them before he could keep it. It was more than he'd said to anyone about his brother's death. It was a small, broken piece of his heart offered up in the quiet dark. Rhett didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her eyes met his across the flickering light, and for the first time there was something other than watchfulness in them. The tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction, a barely perceptible loosening of her armor. In the shared, unspoken language of loss, they had found a single common word. The town of dusty roads and suspicious eyes was a place Cal avoided. It was a place of ghosts, a place where the memory of his brother's easy laughter echoed in the silent spaces between buildings. But supplies were low, and the ranch couldn't survive on silence alone. The journey into town with Rhett was thick with a new kind of tension, a fragile truce being tested by the outside world. She sat beside him on the wagon wearing one of David's old faded blue shirts. The sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms corded with a wiry strength that belied her small frame. The shirt hung on her too broad in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves, yet she wore it like chainmail. It was a borrowed skin, a second layer of defense against the prying eyes of the world. As they walked into the general store, a hush fell over the room. The lazy drone of conversation died. Eyes followed them sharp and judging. Cal could feel the whispers like insects crawling on his skin, a poison that sought to find a way in. They saw what their small, cruel minds wanted to see: a quiet, grieving man and the woman he'd bought at auction. They saw property, not a person. They saw a transaction, not a silent act of rebellion. A rancher named Jed, a man whose casual cruelty was as plain as his tobacco-stained teeth, cornered them by the flour barrels. His eyes, small and mean, raked over Rhett with an air of appraisal, as if she were a horse whose teeth he was about to check. "Well, Cal," he drawled, a smirk twisting his lips. "See, you finally bought yourself some help. She looked to be worth the price." Rhett flinched. It was a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw, a flicker in her otherwise steady gaze. But she did not look away from Jed's sneering face. She held his stare, her silence a more potent weapon than any curse he could have imagined. Cal stepped slightly in front of her, his body a quiet shield. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His voice, when it came, was dangerously low, the sound of stones grinding together. "She's not property, Jed." He held the man's gaze until Jed, unnerved by the cold, unwavering certainty in Cal's eyes, finally looked away, muttering under his breath. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a line drawn in the dust of the store floor, a border declared. As they left the wagon loaded with sacks of flour and salt, Rhett looked at him. A question lingered in her dark eyes, a silent inquiry that he had no answer for. He had defended her. Not out of ownership, not out of duty, but out of something else. Something he didn't have a name for yet. He had simply acted on an instinct as old as the hills, the need to protect something of worth, not because it was his, but because it was. A late autumn storm was brewing in the west, the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The air was heavy charged with the promise of rain. The roof over the porch had a leak, a slow, patient drip that had been eating away at the wood for months, a small wound Cal had never found the will to mend. He brought out a ladder and a box of rusty nails, his movements slow and deliberate. He expected Rhett to stay inside, out of the wind that was beginning to bite with the cold teeth of the coming season. Instead, she appeared at his side, holding a hammer. The tool looked large and heavy in her small hand, but she held it with a familiar ease. She didn't ask. She simply took a handful of nails from the box, her fingers brushing against his for a fleeting electric moment, and climbed the ladder to the other end of the porch roof. They worked in a shared, unspoken rhythm, the silence broken only by the wind and the steady, syncopated beat of their hammers. It became a conversation without words, a language all its own. Thwack, I am here. Thwack, I am strong. Thwack, thwack. We can hold against the storm. As they worked, a sudden, violent gust of wind whipped across the yard, pushing the loose sleeve of her borrowed shirt up her arm. For a single, unguarded moment, it revealed a scar that circled her wrist like a pale, ugly bracelet. It was an old brand, faded, but undeniable, a cruel, swirling T burned into her skin. Cal's hammer faltered for a single beat. His eyes met hers across the length of the roof. He saw the flash of shame in her gaze, a raw, vulnerable thing followed instantly by a fierce, defiant fire that sought to burn it away. He said nothing. He simply looked away, back to the nail he was about to drive, and brought his hammer down with a sharp, definitive crack. He granted her the dignity of his silence, a small act of kindness that was worth more than any words of pity. Later, as she handed him a nail, her eyes fell upon a name carved deep into one of the main porch beams. David. It was carved with a loving, unsteady hand, the work of a boy dreaming of a future. She looked from the name to Cal's face to the hard lines of his jaw, and the deep, quiet sorrow in his eyes. And for the first time, she saw the full depth of the chasm his brother's loss had left behind. She saw that his fortress of silence was not built of anger, but of a grief so profound it had no words. They were both scarred, branded by a past that would not let them go. And in that shared, silent understanding, the rhythm of their hammers found a new, stronger beat. He came out of the dusk like a ghost, a small, fleeting shadow that materialized from the purple haze where the plains met the sky. He stumbled and fell near the well, a small, dark shape against the dying light. At first, Cal thought it was a coyote, wounded and desperate. But the shape was too human, its collapse too final. He and Rhett reached the boy at the same time, moving as one without a word exchanged. They were a unit now, their rhythms tuned to the land and to each other. The boy lay sprawled in the dust, no older than 10, his clothes little more than rags clinging to a frame made of bone and fear. His face was pale with an exhaustion so deep it was close to death, and he was clutching a small, lumpy burlap sack to his chest, as if it held the last treasure in the world. As Rhett knelt and gently turned him over, the boy's eyes flew open. They were wide with a fear so profound it was almost silent, the terror of a hunted animal that has run out of earth to run on. He tried to scramble away his limbs, refusing to obey a pathetic, desperate attempt to find an escape that didn't exist. "It's all right," Rhett said. Her voice was softer than Cal had ever heard it, a gentle murmur that was a stark contrast to her usual guarded silence. It was the voice of someone speaking to a piece of her own broken past. "We won't hurt you." Cal offered the boy water in a tin dipper from the well. He drank frantically, his eyes darting between the two of them, still coiled with terror, not yet daring to believe in this small, unexpected kindness. When the dipper was empty, Rhett reached out and gently brushed the matted, sweat-soaked hair from the boy's forehead to check for fever. As she did, his collar, frayed and torn, fell open, and there on the delicate, dirt-streaked skin of his neck was a small, brutally stark brand, a swirling, elegant T. The air grew cold, the warmth of the evening sucked away in a single, icy gasp. It was a perfect, smaller match to the scar that circled Rhett's wrist. This was not a stray. This was not a random fugitive from hunger or hardship. This was a message sent from a past she had tried to outrun. A piece of that past had just collapsed on their doorstep, bleeding and broken. Without a word, Cal moved. He scooped the boy into his arms. He was light as a bundle of sticks, a fragile weight that felt heavier than anything Cal had ever carried. As he lifted him, the boy's eyes fluttered open one last time, focusing on Rhett's face. "My name is Eli." He whispered, his voice a dry, cracking rustle of sound. Then his eyes rolled back, and he fell into the deep, merciful darkness of unconsciousness. Cal held him, the setting sun casting their 3 long shadows across the yard, shadows that now stretched all the way back to a past he was only just beginning to understand. For 2 days, Eli burned with fever. The heat radiated from his small body, a desperate, consuming fire. And for 2 days, Rhett did not leave his side. She nursed him with a fierce, tender devotion that stunned Cal. She bathed his forehead with rags dipped in cool well water. She patiently spooned thin, salted broth between his cracked lips. And she sat by his makeshift bed on the floor through the long, quiet nights, a silent, unmovable guardian. In those 2 days, Cal saw her transform. The guarded survivor he had brought to his ranch was gone. In her place was a protector, a woman whose own pain was eclipsed by her determination to shield this small, broken boy. She was no longer just tending to a stranger. She was tending to a piece of herself. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. The consuming heat receded, leaving the boy drenched in sweat, but breathing deeply and evenly for the first time. He was asleep, a true healing sleep. The quiet of the house was different now, filled not with the heavy silence of grief, but with a fragile, watchful peace. Rhett sat by the hearth, where a low fire crackled and hissed. Her silhouette was stark against the flickering light, her face weary, but her posture unwavering. Cal stood by the window, watching the moonless plains, giving her the space her silence demanded. "Thorn." She said, her voice low and devoid of emotion, the sound barely disturbing the quiet of the room. "His name is Silas Thorn." Cal turned from the window. The name was unfamiliar, but the tone of her voice told him everything he needed to know. It was a name that carried the weight of a curse. "He owns half the valley." Rhett continued, her eyes still fixed on the fire, as if she were reading the story in the flames. "He doesn't buy land. He collects it. He collects people too. My family, we were indentured to his. A debt from my grandfather's time, a piece of paper that gave him the right to own us." Her voice was flat, a recitation of facts, not a plea for pity. "Thorn calls it a contract. We called it a cage." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were not those of a victim, but of a soldier recounting a long and brutal war. "He brands what he owns: cattle, horses, people. He says it prevents theft." She unconsciously touched her own wrist, where the ugly, swirling scar lay hidden beneath the sleeve of the borrowed shirt. "Eli is my sister's boy. She didn't survive his birth. He must have run. No one runs from Thorn. Not and lives." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating as smoke. The pieces clicked into place for Cal, forming a picture more terrible than he could have imagined. The brand on her wrist, the brand on the boy's neck. The firelight confession was complete. He now understood. He hadn't just bought a woman at an auction. He hadn't just performed a single reckless act of defiance. He had stepped into the middle of a war he knew nothing about, a war against a man who believed he had the right to own the very souls of others. And that war had just found its way to his door. Eli's recovery was slow, a quiet tide returning to a desolate shore. The fever left him, but the fear remained a deep, abiding shadow in his eyes. Under the watchful, silent safety of the ranch, however, his spirit, once broken, began to mend. He took his first tentative steps out of the house, not toward the open plains, but toward Rhett as she worked in her garden. He followed her everywhere after that, a silent, devoted shadow, his small hand often clutching the hem of her worn dress. He did not speak, but his presence was a constant question, a search for an anchor in a world that had tried to drown him. One afternoon, as he sat watching her pull weeds, a mourning dove startled from its nest in the eaves of the porch, its wings whistling a soft, melancholic note as it flew away. In his fever-weakened state, a single heartbroken word escaped Eli's lips, a whisper of sound barely carried on the breeze. "Mama." The word struck Rhett like a physical blow. She froze, her hands stilled in the dirt. She did not cry. Her face, a mask of hardened control, simply crumpled for a moment, revealing the raw, aching grief beneath. Then she knelt and gathered the boy into her arms, holding him not with pity, but with a fierce, grounding empathy. It was the embrace of one survivor holding another, a silent promise that here, in this small patch of earth, they would not be alone. Watching them from the porch, Cal felt the fortress around his own heart begin to crumble, the stones loosened by a pain that was not his own, but was now inextricably bound to him. This was what his brother David had died for. The pieces, sharp and jagged, clicked into place in his mind. The hushed rumors after his brother's death, the whispers of a family David had been helping, the carefully worded story of a riding accident. He now saw the truth with a terrible clarity. It hadn't been a random family. It had been an indentured family, a mother and her son, and they had been running from Silas Thorn. David had tried to help them, and Thorn had made an example of him. He walked to the main porch beam, the one his brother had chosen to bear his name. David. The letters were carved deep into the weathered wood, the work of a young man full of hope, staking his claim on a life of freedom. Cal took out his pocket knife. The blade was worn, the edge still keen. He didn't carve a name. A name was a target, a claim that could be challenged by men with paper and laws written in their favor. Instead, below his brother's name, he pressed the tip of the blade into the wood. He carved a single deep notch into the grain. It was a silent mark, a vow understood by no one but himself. It said, "This far and no further." It said, "Here we make our stand." He had added his own promise to his brother's, a debt to be paid not in vengeance, but in protection. The quiet ranch was no longer just a place of grief. It was now the front line of a war he had inherited, a sanctuary he would defend with his last breath. He arrived as the sun was setting, casting long, predatory shadows across the yard. Silas Thorne did not look like a monster. Monsters Cal knew rarely did. He was a man of wealth, and bearing his clothes immaculate, his leather boots polished to a high sheen that seemed to repel the dust of the valley. He rode a magnificent black stallion that was as arrogant as its master, and he was flanked by two men whose faces were as hard and empty as the plains in midwinter. Thorne dismounted with an easy, practiced grace, handing his reins to one of his men without a glance. His smile when he offered it to Cal was thin and devoid of warmth, a polite stretching of the lips that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. Cal. He said, his voice smooth and cultured a jarring sound in the rough-hewn silence of the ranch. A pleasure to finally meet the man who has taken such an interest in my property. He let the word hang in the air, a deliberate insult. From his coat he produced a rolled parchment tied with a black silk ribbon. He held it up, not as an offer, but as a weapon. I have here a legally binding indenture contract for one Rivette bound by her family's debt to my service. The law in this territory is quite clear on the matter of runaway property. His eyes flickered past Cal to the house where Rhett stood, framed in the doorway, a pale, defiant ghost. Eli was half hidden behind her skirts, his small hand clutching the fabric. I also hear a boy one of my wards has gone missing. Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. A boy named Eli. He paused, letting the name settle. I'm a reasonable man. Return what is mine and we can forget this unfortunate misunderstanding. No harm done. Cal stood his ground on the porch, his hands empty at his sides. His gaze did not waver. He did not look at the parchment, the symbol of a corrupt and broken law. He looked directly into Thorne's eyes, meeting the man's veiled threats with a wall of quiet, unshakable resolve. She's not going anywhere, Cal said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard with absolute finality. Neither is the boy. Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation, the annoyance of a king whose decree has been ignored by a peasant. He took a step back, his hand resting casually on the ornate handle of the pistol at his hip. A foolish choice, he said, turning back to his horse. A very foolish choice. The law is on my side, Cal, and where the law proves too slow, he swung himself gracefully into the saddle. I have other more efficient means. The threat was as clear as the coming night. He wheeled his horse around his men, falling into formation behind him. They rode away, not in a hurry, but with the slow, confident certainty of predators who know their prey is trapped. The quiet war had just been declared. The war began not with gunfire, but with the quiet, creeping cruelty of sabotage. Thorne was a patient predator, content to circle his prey, to test its defenses, to bleed it slowly. A few days after his visit, Cal went to the well for the morning's water and found it tasting bitter and strange, the metallic tang of death on his tongue. He lowered a bucket with a lantern tied to it and saw the cause, a dead rabbit, its neck broken with a vicious snap, had been dropped down its depths. It was a long, back-breaking day's work to haul the bloated carcass out and purify the water with lye and boiling. It was a message delivered with cold efficiency. I can poison you from the ground up. A week later, he woke to the sound of distant, distressed lowing. A 50-foot section of the southern fence line had been cut in the night, the heavy gauge wire snipped clean through with powerful cutters. A dozen head of his best cattle had wandered out onto the open plains, tempting targets for rustlers or wolves. It took him and Rhett 2 full days on horseback, under a merciless, unforgiving sun, to track them down and herd them back. They worked in tandem, their movements efficient and sure. There was no need for words. A sharp whistle from Cal, a pointed gesture from Rhett, a shared understanding of the land and the animals. They were a unit hardened and honed by the silent pressure of Thorn's war. Each act of sabotage was designed to wear them down, to drain their resources, their energy, and most importantly, their will to fight. But with each cut fence they mended, with each new challenge they overcame. Together something unintended was happening. Thorn was not breaking them. He was forging them. That evening they sat on the porch steps, exhausted and sore, the silence between them comfortable now, a shared space of weary accomplishment. Cal had a raw rope burn on his hand from a stubborn calf. Without a word, Rhett went inside and came back with a clean rag and a small tin of salve. She sat beside him and began to tend to the wound, her touch gentle and sure. He didn't pull away. He watched her deft fingers, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern. Their resolve was not cracking. It was annealing, turning from the brittle anger of their individual griefs into the hard, resilient steel of a shared purpose. They were no longer just 2 broken people living under the same roof. They were partners in a war, and tonight, under the vast, quiet canopy of the stars, they had won the first small battle. The town's sheriff was a man named Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of compromises and disappointments. His small, dusty office smelled of stale coffee and the slow decay of hope. Cal stood before his desk, his hat in his hands, and laid out the facts simply and without emotion: the visit from Thorn, the poisoned well, the cut fence. He did not speak of the brands on Rhett and Eli. Some wounds were too deep to be exposed to the harsh light of a lawman's office. Sheriff Miller listened. His fingers steepled his eyes, weary. He was a man who had seen too much of the darkness that lay just beneath the thin veneer of civilization in this territory. When Cal was finished, the sheriff let out a long, slow sigh, a sound that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul. Corso. Cal, I believe you, he said, his voice gravelly. I know what kind of man Silas Thorn is. Lord knows I've seen enough of his handiwork. But believing and proving are 2 different rivers, and in this valley Thorn owns the only ferry that crosses them. He gestured with a tired hand to a stack of papers on his desk, held down by a rock. He's already filed the indenture contract with the territorial magistrate. On paper, that woman, Rhett, she belongs to him. The law's on his side. He leaned forward, his voice dropping the words meant only for Cal. And the boy he's listed as a runaway ward. Thorn has a legal claim to him, too. My hands are tied, Cal. If he comes to claim his property with that paper in his hand and I'm with him, I can't stop him. I'd be breaking the law. Miller stood and walked to the window, his silhouette stark against the bright, indifferent glare of the dusty street. This ain't a fight about what's right, Cal. Justice isn't about what's right. It's about who has the most money and the most guns. This is a fight about what's written down on a piece of paper. He turned back, his face etched with a grim resignation. My advice, give him what he wants. You can't win against a man like that. Not in a world built by men like him. Cal stood up, his own resolve hardening in the face of the sheriff's weary surrender. He hadn't come for advice. He'd come to see where the law stood. Now he knew. It stood squarely on the side of the man with the most money and the blackest heart. He was on his own. He nodded once to the sheriff, a silent acknowledgement of the man's honesty, if not his courage, and walked out into the unforgiving sunlight, the weight of the coming storm settling heavily on his shoulders. The quiet war of sabotage had left its mark not just on the land, but on the boy. The fear had begun to creep back into Eli's eyes. He'd stopped talking again, retreating into the silent, haunted fortress of his mind. His nights were filled with muffled cries that tore at the quiet fabric of the house. He understood in the primal, wordless way a child does that the monster he had fled was now circling their small sanctuary, its shadow falling long and cold over their lives. Cal watched the boy, his own heart aching with a fierce protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. This was more than a fight over land or principle now. It was a fight for a child's soul. One evening while Rhett and Eli were inside their quiet movements, a small pocket of warmth against the encroaching dark, Cal sat on the porch steps. He took a block of soft pine wood from his pocket and his worn pocket knife. He worked slowly, the blade whispering against the grain, peeling away thin curls of wood that smelled of the forest. His hands, calloused and strong from years of ranch work, moved with a surprising delicacy. He wasn't thinking not in words. He was just letting his memory of his brother guide him. David had been the carver, the one who could find the shape of a living thing inside a dead piece of wood. He could see a horse, or a wolf, or a bird, and set it free. An hour later, as the last of the light bled from the sky, it was finished. A small, simple bird, its wings half spread, as if caught in the moment just before flight. It wasn't perfect. It was a little rough, a little crooked its proportions, not quite right. But it was whole. It was a promise of freedom carved from a piece of wood. He found Eli huddled by the window, a small, still figure watching the dark plains, as if he could will Thorne's men away with the force of his stare. Cal knelt beside him, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He didn't speak. He simply opened his hand and placed the wooden bird in the boy's small, cold palm. Eli looked down at the carving, his fingers tracing its rough shape. "Birds can fly away from anything," Cal said softly, his voice a low rumble. Eli's fingers closed around the carving, his small hand gripping it tight. He looked up from the bird to Cal's face, and in the depths of his terrified eyes, a tiny, fragile spark of trust ignited. It was the first light Cal had seen in him for days. Rhett, watching from the doorway, felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was the sight of a quiet, broken man learning to be a father. He was not just fighting for their survival anymore. He was building them a future, one small, carved piece of hope at a time. The attack came in the dead of night under the cloak of a new moon that offered no comfort and no light. It wasn't the sound that woke Cal, but the smell, the acrid, hungry scent of burning hay and dry timber that caught in the back of his throat. He threw open the door to a vision from hell. The barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring orange beast that clawed at the night sky, its greedy mouth consuming the structure he and his brother had built with their own hands. It spat a shower of glowing embers onto the dry grass, each one a seed of destruction. "Oi!" Rhett Eli the fire. He yelled, his voice raw with a sudden sharp terror. Chaos erupted. Cal sprinted for the horse corral, his only thought to free the panicked, screaming animals before the fire trapped them. The heat was a physical blow, a searing wall that pushed him back. Rhett was right behind him, her face grim and set in the flickering, hellish light. She moved with a purpose that defied fear, her movements quick and efficient, as she unlatched the gate, herding the terrified horses out into the safety of the far pasture. Even Eli, small and scared, did his part. He ran back and forth from the well with a small wooden bucket, throwing useless, defiant splashes of water at the base of the inferno. It wasn't about putting the fire out. It was about fighting back. It was about refusing to be a passive victim. The heat was immense, a physical presence that seared the lungs and stung the eyes. They worked until their faces were black with soot, and their muscles screamed in protest, their lungs burning with every ragged breath. They managed to save the animals, but the barn was a total loss. As dawn broke its gentle pink and gold, a cruel mockery of the night's violence, they stood together, a small, defiant trio, watching the last of the barn's structure collapse into a smoldering heap of charred beams and gray ash. There was no note, no sign of the attackers. There didn't need to be. The message was written in the thick black smoke that still stained the morning sky, a poison that lingered in the air. This was Thorne's final warning. The next fire would be the house. The next offering to the flames would be them. They stood before the smoking ruins of the barn. As the sun climbed higher, the heat from the ashes a grim reminder of the night's terror. The air was thick with the smell of defeat, a bitter perfume Thorne had left for them. He had meant to break them, to show them the futility of their stand, to burn the hope right out of their hearts. Cal looked at Rhett. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair wild and matted, but her eyes reflecting the glowing embers were clear and hard as diamonds. He looked at Eli, who stood close to her, his small hand clutching the carved wooden bird, as if it were a talisman against the evil of the world. He saw not fear in them, but a weary, hardened resolve. A quiet strength that had been forged in the night's fire. He knew Thorne would be back. He would come with his paper and his guns, and this time he would not be asking. The time for warnings was over. He'll give us one last chance. Cal said, his voice rough from the smoke and the bone-deep weariness. The woman and the boy. Or the fire. He was not asking her what to do. He was not giving her a choice. He was stating the terms of their surrender, laying the cold, hard facts out between them like stones. Rhett met his gaze. Her eyes were steady, unwavering. She had been running her whole life from one cage to another, from one master to the next. Here in this place of ash and impending violence, surrounded by the ruins of a barn that had stood for 20 years, she had finally found something worth defending. Something worth dying for. I have been someone else's property my entire life. Cal. She said, her voice quiet but ringing with the strength of forged iron. I will not be his again. She looked at the small, sturdy house, their defiant sanctuary against the vast, indifferent plains. This is my home. Blood leaves, but heart stays. In that moment, she was no longer the woman he had bought. She was a partner, a warrior, a mother. Cal nodded slowly, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He turned to face the direction Thorne would come from his shoulders, set like the mountains on the horizon. I'm not leaving, he said. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was a simple statement of truth as solid and real as the ground beneath his feet. Rhett stood beside him, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder, a silent gesture of protection and belonging. Neither are we, she said. It was a pact made in the ruins, a family forged in the face of the flame. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by the law. But they were united, and they were ready. They had 2 days. They used them not to run, but to prepare. The time for flight was over. The time for fortification had begun. Cal boarded up the lower windows of the house with thick pine planks, leaving only small defensible slits for his rifle. The house, once a place of hollow grief, was now becoming a fortress. Rhett, using her intimate knowledge of the land, the knowledge of the hunted, dug shallow trenches in the yard, and covered them with dry brush and loose dirt, simple but effective traps for charging horses. Inside, she stockpiled ammunition and supplies, turning their small kitchen into a makeshift armory. Eli, too small to fight, became their scout. From the small, dusty attic window, he had a clear, unobstructed view of the vast, empty plains. He sat there for hours, silent and watchful, his small hand gripping the carved wooden bird Cal had given him. He was a small boy tasked with an enormous burden, and he bore it with a solemn gravity that broke Cal's heart. On the 3rd day at high noon, under a sun that offered no comfort, he saw them. A cloud of dust on the horizon slowly resolving into the dark shapes of men on horseback. "They're coming!" he called down, his voice trembling but clear. Thorn arrived with 6 men fanning out in a half-circle to surround the house. They moved with a swaggering confidence, expecting a quick and brutal end to this foolish defiance. "Cal!" Thorn's voice boomed across the yard, a sound of arrogant command. "Last chance, send them out and I'll let you live to see another sunrise." The only answer was the sharp metallic click of Cal's rifle being cocked, a sound that was a definitive and final refusal. The siege began. The first rider who charged the house, whooping and hollering, was met with a single deafening blast from Cal's rifle. The man tumbled from his saddle, a crumpled heap in the dust. His horse, spooked by the shot, and the unfamiliar ground, stumbled into one of Rhett's hidden trenches, its panicked cry a shrill note of chaos. The fight devolved into a tense, brutal exchange of gunfire. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the house, splintering the wood, shattering the fragile peace they had built. Cal was a patient, deadly shot, a man transformed by the need to protect. He made every bullet count. Beside him, Rhett reloaded the second rifle, her hands steady, her movements precise and economical. They were a seamless unit moving in the confines of the small house, as if they had been fighting side by side their entire lives. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. The law had abandoned them. But they were not defending land or cattle. They were defending their right to exist, their right to be more than a name on a piece of paper, their right to call a small patch of this unforgiving earth their home. The afternoon wore on the air, growing thick with gun smoke and the metallic tension of a drawn-out fight. A bullet had grazed Cal's arm, a hot, searing line of pain that he ignored, his focus narrowed to the figures moving outside his walls. They had held them off, but their ammunition was running low. Rhett's movements as she reloaded were still precise, but he could see the grim calculation in her eyes. They both knew this couldn't last. Thorn, enraged by their stubborn, impossible resistance, grew reckless. The slow bleeding had failed. Now he would go for the throat. "Burn them out," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. He ordered his men to charge the house with torches, ready to fulfill his promise of fire. It was the moment Cal had feared, the one he knew they could not win. They couldn't fight off a direct, all-out assault by men intent on turning their home into their coffin. As Thorn's men began their charge, their whoops and hollers a savage cry of victory, a new sound cut through the chaos, the thunder of approaching hooves. Not 2 or 3, but a dozen. For a heart-stopping moment, Cal thought Thorn had brought reinforcements, that the final crushing blow was about to fall. But from the cloud of dust that boiled up on the horizon emerged not Thorn's men, but Sheriff Miller, flanked by a posse of grim-faced ranchers from the town. The townsfolk who had whispered and judged, who had turned a blind eye, had finally been moved to act. They had seen the column of black smoke from the barn fire that morning. They had heard Thorn boasting in the saloon about burning out the stubborn rancher who dared defy him. The public test, the quiet decency Cal had shown the line he had drawn in the dust of the general store, it had finally outweighed their fear of Thorn. The fight when it came was short and decisive. Faced with a dozen fresh guns and the undeniable authority of the law, Thorn's men threw down their weapons, their bravado evaporating into the smoke-filled air. Sheriff Miller walked up to Thorn, who sat on his horse, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. The sheriff's own face was hard as granite, his weary resignation replaced by a cold, hard anger. "Silas," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "That paper in your pocket might give you a claim on people in a magistrate's court, but this," he gestured to the bullet-riddled house, the smoking ruins of the barn, "this is arson and attempted murder. And that's a law even you can't buy your way out of." As Miller's deputy cuffed the stunned land baron, the sheriff looked over at Cal, who stood on his porch rifle, still in hand. A quiet, profound respect passed between the two men. "A man's home is his own," the sheriff said, his voice carrying across the yard. "You made us remember that." The debt to his brother Cal realized had finally been paid not in vengeance, but in the steadfast defense of a home. Months passed, turning the page of the season. The harsh winds of winter gave way to the gentle, life-giving rains of spring. The world once scarred and blackened returned to life, and so did the ranch. With the help of their neighbors, men who now met Cal's gaze with respect instead of suspicion, a new barn was built stronger and sturdier than the last. The scent of fresh-cut pine and honest labor replaced the bitter smell of ash. The whispers in town had changed too. They no longer followed Rhett like a cloud of dust. They had turned to quiet nods of respect, to offers of help at the general store. The story of the siege had become a local legend, a tale told over beers in the saloon, a testament to how a quiet man, a defiant woman, and a lost boy had stood against a tyrant and won. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet, meaningful labor. Eli's laughter, a sound once thought impossible, now echoed in the yard as he chased the chickens, his small face bright with a joy he had never known. The shadow of fear had finally begun to recede from his eyes. Rhett's garden, the one she had carved from the hard-packed, neglected soil, bloomed with a riot of color, her hands bringing forth life and sustenance. One warm evening, as the sun bled gold and purple across the vast plains, Cal stood on the porch, looking at the beam where his brother's name was carved. The raw wounds of his grief had begun to scar over, leaving not an empty chasm, but a quiet, foundational strength. He took out his old pocket knife, its blade worn smooth with use. Below the name David, and below the single defiant notch he had carved in the face of Thorn's threats, he began to work. He carved slowly with reverence, the blade whispering against the weathered wood. First a C, then an A, then an L. Beside it he etched R-E-T, and below them both, smaller but just as deep, he carved E-L-I. 3 names bound together not by law or by blood, but by the fire they had walked through, and the home they had refused to surrender. He looked at the names, a silent declaration etched into the very heart of the house. He had not just rebuilt a ranch. He had built a family. Because sometimes in the harshest of lands where survival is a daily battle, a home is not a place you find. It is the only vow you need to keep. In the unforgiving heart of the West, a home is not something you are born into. It is a fortress you build from broken wood, silent promises, and the stubborn will to protect what you love. It is a testament that the strongest families are not forged from blood, but from courage, choice, and earned redemption. If this story of Calret and Eli stirred something quiet in your heart, if you believe that true strength is found not in a fist, but in a mended fence, then you understand the tales we tell. Thank you for watching Wild West Love Trails. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Trails and hit the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the heart of the frontier where the most profound stories are about the quiet, defiant act of building a home.